Imagine the earth trembling beneath the thunder of hooves. The horizon quakes with dust as thousands of riders sweep across the steppes, swift as shadows, merciless as the storm. Cities crumble, kingdoms tremble. From the forests of Siberia to the sands of Persia, from the walls of China to the gates of Europe, one banner rose above them all, the banner of the Mongols. Never before had the world witnessed such speed, such fury, such scale. The Mongol Empire, forged in blood and fire by Genghis Khan, became the largest contiguous empire in human history. Its dominion stretched across lands so vast that the sun seemed never to set upon it. The might of its armies was unmatched, its reach unstoppable. And yet, it fell. Why? How could a power so absolute, so terrifying, so seemingly eternal collapse within just a few generations? How could an empire that once united East and West, that controlled the Silk Road, that commanded fear from Paris to Baghdad, disintegrate into fragments of memory? And what if it hadn't? What if the Mongol Empire had endured? What if its rulers had found a way to preserve unity, to overcome division, to transform plunder into permanence? What kind of world would we be living in today? Would the Mongols have shaped a different destiny for Eurasia, for all of us? Tonight, we step into that shadowed past. We retrace the footsteps of conquerors, the rise of a people who carved their empire upon the bones of kingdoms. We will uncover the cracks that spread through their foundations, the choices that doomed them. And then, we will dare to imagine a history where the Mongol Empire did not vanish into dust, but remained, a giant striding across the centuries. This is not a tale of fantasy. This is the echo of history, retold through the lens of possibility. A story to challenge the way we think about power, about fragility, about the fate of empires. If you've ever wondered how a single twist of fate might have changed everything, you are in the right place. This is What If Wars, where history's greatest battles and empires are reimagined, where we uncover not only what was, but what might have been. If you are drawn to the mysteries of the past, if you long to walk the forgotten roads of history, then join us. Subscribe now and journey with us through the echoes of time. For tonight, we begin with a question as old as empire itself. Why did the greatest empire the world had ever seen collapse? And what if it never fell? The story begins on the vast steppes of Central Asia, where the wind howls across endless grasslands and life is carved out under an unforgiving sky. Here, survival demands resilience. Families move with their herds, chasing pasture across frozen winters and scorching summers. It was a land that forged people as hard as the iron in their blades, as swift as the horses they rode. Out of this landscape, out of obscurity, rose a man who would shape the fate of continents, Temujin, who would become known to the world as Genghis Khan. He was not born into power. He was not destined by noble blood or inherited wealth to rule. He was born into struggle. As a boy, his father was poisoned by rivals. His family cast out, abandoned, left to starve on the steppes. In that crucible of betrayal and hardship, Temujin learned the one lesson that would define his life. Strength must be forged, not granted. Slowly he gathered allies, not through mere fear, but through loyalty, discipline, and a vision greater than clan rivalry. He broke traditions that bound the tribes in endless cycles of revenge. He rewarded merit over birth. A poor man who proved his worth in battle could rise higher than a noble by lineage. He took the fractured Mongol tribes, locked for centuries in feuds, and bound them together beneath one purpose. And once united, the storm was unleashed. The Mongol army was unlike anything the world had ever seen. They moved with terrifying speed, a tide of horsemen sweeping across the horizon. Each warrior carried multiple horses, switching mounts in battle to maintain relentless pace. Their arrows could pierce armor from 100 yards. Their discipline was absolute. Entire units could wheel, feint retreat, and draw enemies into traps with precision. And above all, they mastered fear itself. Tales of their ruthlessness spread faster than their armies. Cities surrendered without a fight, knowing resistance meant annihilation. From the Great Wall of China to the banks of the Danube, their thunder rolled. In less than a lifetime, their dominion stretched farther than Rome, farther than Alexander. No empire had ever expanded so rapidly. Great dynasties fell like sandcastles before the tide. The Khwarezmian Shahdam of Persia, the Jin dynasty of northern China, kingdoms of Eastern Europe, even the mighty walls of Zhengdu, today's Beijing, fell to their onslaught. But their conquest was not only destruction. Beneath the iron fist of Mongol rule, something extraordinary took shape. The Silk Road, long fragmented by war and banditry, became secure under Mongol protection. Caravans traveled from Venice to Xi'an, carrying silks, spices, gunpowder, mathematics, and ideas. For the first time, East and West were not divided by peril, but joined under a single empire. A merchant in Baghdad could send goods to Beijing with relative safety, his path guarded by Mongol patrols. A European traveler like Marco Polo could cross deserts and mountains into the heart of China, carrying stories that would ignite the imagination of Europe. Even in governance, the Mongols surprised the world. Genghis Khan created the Yasa, a code of laws that bound his people in discipline. Religious tolerance became policy. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, shamans all found a place under Mongol rule. Scholars were spared in conquered cities, engineers valued, artisans relocated to enrich the empire. Though their conquest was brutal, their rule often carried a strange, pragmatic fairness. At its height, the Mongol Empire was not just vast, it was seamless. Imagine it. A single realm stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, from the frozen forests of Siberia to the burning sands of Mesopotamia. No passport, no border checks, no broken roads, only the empire's law, the empire's order, the empire's fearsome protection. It was said that a maiden could walk across the empire carrying a sack of gold and remain unharmed. So secure was the Pax Mongolica. It was the closest humanity had come to a world stitched together by one hand. A bridge of cultures, a crucible of exchange, a living experiment in global connection centuries before the word globalization existed. And yet, even at its zenith, shadows gathered. The same winds that carried the banners of the Mongols across the steppes would one day carry whispers of division, of ambition, of betrayal. The empire that seemed invincible was already silently sowing the seeds of its own collapse. At first, the Mongol Empire seemed untouchable, a giant carved from conquest, stitched together by the will of one man. But no empire, however vast, can outrun the weight of time. Beneath the thunder of hooves and the gleam of banners, fractures began to spread. What appeared eternal was, in truth, fragile. The seeds of collapse were sown in the very soil of their greatness. The story begins with death, the death of Genghis Khan himself. In 1227, the man who had risen from orphaned exile to master of half the known world was gone. His empire was vast, his legacy immense, but his vision was unfinished. He left behind not a single heir, but many sons, grandsons, and generals, each loyal in his lifetime, but bound by ambition once he was gone. Succession, the silent executioner of empires, struck swiftly. Genghis had appointed his third son, Ogedei, as his successor. For a time, the empire held steady. Under Ogedei, the Mongols rode deeper into Europe, crushing Poland, Hungary, and standing at the threshold of Vienna. But even as victories piled high, the unity that had bound them began to fray. Every Khanate, the Golden Horde in the west, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Yuan dynasty in China, saw itself as heir to the same legacy. Brothers became rivals, cousins became enemies. By the time Ogedei died in 1241, the empire's fate hung on a knife's edge. Who would succeed him? In the vacuum, campaigns in Europe faltered. Armies that could have ridden further into the continent turned back, recalled to the heartland to argue, to scheme, to fight among themselves. The dream of eternal conquest stumbled not because of defeat in battle, but because the throne in Karakorum stood empty, contested, fragile. And this became a pattern again and again. Every succession crisis weakened the unity of the empire. Genghis Khan's grandsons each saw themselves as destined rulers. Kublai Khan, the conqueror of China, clashed with his brother Arik Boka in a civil war that split the empire apart. Hulagu Khan of Persia feuded with Berka Khan of the Golden Horde, Muslim against Christian sympathizer, cousin against cousin. The blood that once flowed together in conquest now spilled against itself in fratricide. But division was only one of the cracks. Governing such a vast expanse proved a challenge no warrior's sword could solve. The Mongols were masters of battle, but ruling was another art entirely. Their empire stretched across deserts, mountains, forests, and seas, binding together Persians, Chinese, Arabs, Russians, Turks, and countless others, each with their own languages, religions, and customs. For a time, Mongol pragmatism worked. They allowed religious freedom, respected skilled administrators, adopted systems from conquered peoples. Yet this tolerance could not mask the difficulties of ruling millions who did not see themselves as Mongols. The further the empire stretched, the thinner its unity wore. A ruler in Persia could not easily command loyalty from a general in China. Messages took months to travel, decisions longer still. The empire that had been one fist began to open, each finger pulling in a different direction. Economy, too, betrayed them. The Mongol machine was built on war. It thrived on conquest, on the wealth of captured cities, the tribute of terrified kings. But conquest cannot last forever. When expansion slowed, when new lands became harder to take, the flow of riches faltered. Maintaining vast armies, courts, and administrations required more than plunder. It required stability, trade, taxation, a system the Mongols never fully mastered. The Silk Road, once their lifeline, began to crumble under the weight of unrest. Banditry returned. Local rulers defied the Khans. Caravans dwindled. Without constant war or reliable commerce, the empire's heart grew hungry. An empire cannot feed itself forever on memories of glory. And then, nature itself turned against them. In the mid-14th century, the world darkened with plague. The Black Death, carried by fleas and merchants alike, tore through Asia and Europe. The very trade routes that once united continents under Mongol watch became arteries of death. Cities emptied, economies collapsed, populations withered. The Mongols, who once commanded life and death through conquest, could not hold back disease. Even their fiercest riders could not outrun a plague that swept silently, mercilessly, through yurts and palaces alike. Climate, too, shifted. The steppes that had once fed endless herds suffered harsher winters, drier summers. Pastures shrank, horses starved, and with them the lifeblood of Mongol armies waned. Without the grass to feed their mounts, the very engine of conquest slowed. The empire that had risen from the steppe was betrayed by the steppe itself. Add to this the rebellions of subject peoples. In China, resentment boiled beneath the surface. Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty, though powerful, faced endless uprisings. In Persia, the Ilkhanate fractured after the death of rulers without heirs. In Russia, the princes of Moscow slowly rose in defiance of the Golden Horde. Everywhere, the conquered remembered their chains, waiting for weakness to strike. The Mongols, once united by a single vision, now splintered into 4 great khanates, each more concerned with its own survival than the fate of the empire as a whole. The Golden Horde warred with the Ilkhanate. The Yuan clung to China only to be expelled by the Ming. The Chagatai Khanate withered, torn by internal strife. What had been one empire became 4, then many, then none. And so, in less than 2 centuries, the empire that had stretched across the world like a shadow of thunder was gone. Its legacy survived, in laws, in roads, in stories whispered by traders and travelers. But the empire itself was ash, scattered by the winds. It was not defeated by one enemy, not toppled by one battle. It collapsed from within. Succession disputes, civil wars, the impossible burden of governance, the fading of conquest, the scourge of plague, the bite of climate, the fire of rebellion. The Mongol Empire was too vast, too fierce, too sudden to last. And yet, as we trace the cracks that brought it down, we cannot help but wonder, what if those cracks had been sealed? What if the heirs of Genghis Khan had found unity instead of rivalry, reform instead of stagnation, vision instead of greed? What if the Mongol Empire had not fallen but endured? What kind of world would that be? What if the story had turned differently? What if the empire of the horsemen, instead of crumbling into fragments, had found the strength to endure? Imagine the same winds sweeping across the steppe, but instead of carrying whispers of division, they carried unity, laws, reforms, choices that gave the Mongol Empire not just power, but permanence. The first fracture to mend was succession. In our history, every death of a Khan was followed by uncertainty, by factions circling like vultures around an empty throne. But imagine if Genghis Khan, or his immediate heirs, had written a law clear and binding, a codified succession that no prince, no brother, no grandson could dispute. A system where the empire did not pause its wars to argue, where loyalty to one center remained unbroken. With that single act, the endless civil wars that drained their strength might never have been. The Khans would still quarrel, but the empire would endure above their quarrels. Next came the question of governance. The Mongols ruled a tapestry of nations: Chinese farmers, Persian scholars, Russian princes, Arab merchants. In our reality, the Mongols often ruled from above, outsiders imposing order through force and tribute. But imagine if they had done more than tolerate. Imagine if they had invited these conquered peoples into the heart of power, not only as administrators, but as partners. Persians advising Mongols in Persia, Chinese scholars shaping law in China, Russian leaders integrated into steppe councils. The empire would no longer be seen only as conqueror, but as protector, a greater order where loyalty could bring not just survival, but prosperity. And then, the economy. In truth, Mongol power was built on conquest, on the riches of cities reduced to ash. But plunder burns fast. To endure, they would have needed to build a different fire, a fire fed by trade, by taxation, by the beating heart of the Silk Road. And in this alternate history, that is exactly what they did. Instead of demanding endless tribute, the Khans would have established stable systems of tax, fair collection, safe passage. The Silk Road, already under their watch, would become their empire's spine. Caravans moving through Samarkand, Kashgar, and Karakoram would not just bring wealth, but bind the empire together, each province dependent on the other, each trade route a vein feeding the whole. Even the land itself could be answered. In our history, droughts and harsh winters struck the steppes, starving horses, weakening armies. But what if the Mongols had invested in adapting, in storing grain, in supporting irrigation in China and Persia, ensuring supplies for their armies no matter the season? With trade and agriculture reinforcing each other, the empire would not stagger at every blow of climate. And so, in this alternate world, the Mongol Empire stabilizes. It does not fall apart into four khanates tearing at each other's throats. It becomes one empire with many voices. Its borders do not endlessly expand, but they hold. Central Asia remains under its banner. China, under the Yuan, does not collapse to the Ming, because rebellion finds no weakness to strike. Persia, under the Ilkhans, thrives not in division, but in trade, learning, and integration. Even the Golden Horde, instead of crumbling, survives through partnership with the princes of Russia, holding them in a balance of loyalty rather than smothering them in rebellion. Picture it. The 14th century with a Mongol Empire still alive, caravans moving in safety, roads patrolled by imperial guards, a letter written in Baghdad delivered in Beijing, not with fear, but with certainty, scholars traveling without terror, merchants investing without ruin. The Silk Road, instead of decaying, becomes a golden river flowing across Eurasia. Religion, too, would shift. The Mongols had always practiced tolerance, pagans alongside Christians, Buddhists beside Muslims. In our world, this tolerance weakened with time, as khanates took sides in religious wars. But in this alternate timeline, a codified law of tolerance remains. The empire declares, no faith is greater than another beneath the eternal blue sky. Imagine the effect. Muslims free to build mosques in China, Christians maintaining churches in Persia, Buddhists traveling across Central Asia without fear. In an age when Europe still burned with crusades, the Mongols would be the unlikely guardians of coexistence. And what of warfare? Without the constant need for new conquest to fuel their wealth, the Mongols would turn inward, focusing on defending their roads, their borders, their trade. Their armies, once a tide of destruction, would evolve into shields. They would not disappear. No, the thunder of hooves would still echo, but their purpose would shift from conquest to preservation. The empire would ride not to expand, but to maintain, to ensure that no rebellion, no invader, no bandit threatened their fragile stability. The consequences ripple outward. Russia, under Mongol oversight, would not rise so swiftly into independence. The Ottomans, pressing westward, would find themselves checked by a stable Ilkhanate in Persia. Ming China would never be born, for the Yuan dynasty never falls. Europe, recovering from the Black Death, would look east not to fractured khanates, but to a single unified empire, ready for trade. This is not a world where the Mongols dominate the globe. It is a world where they endure, anchoring Central Asia as a stable heart of exchange. A world where the Silk Road does not die, where East and West remain connected centuries longer, where knowledge flows as steadily as spices and silk. It is a quieter empire, not the roaring storm of conquest, but the steady drumbeat of endurance. And in that endurance lies transformation. The Mongol Empire, remembered by us as destroyer, could have been remembered as guardian. Not eternal expansion, but eternal stability. Not terror, but order. Not collapse, but survival. And so we stand at the edge of imagination. A world not ruled by Mongols, but shaped by their endurance. A different Middle Ages, a different modern world. A history where the horsemen of the steppe did not vanish into legend, but remained present, constant, inevitable. If the Mongol Empire had endured, not through endless conquest, but through stability, reforms, and endurance, what would the centuries that followed have looked like? Let us walk together into this imagined future, a world altered not by fantasy, but by the steady pulse of a different history. The first and most immediate consequence would have been the survival of the Silk Road as the great artery of civilization. In our world, after the Mongol Empire fragmented, the Silk Road fractured with it. Bandits returned, local rulers taxed caravans mercilessly, wars broke routes apart, trade dwindled, and the flow of goods and knowledge that once connected East and West slowed to a trickle. But under a stable Mongol Empire, the Silk Road would remain alive. Picture it. Caravans guarded by imperial patrols, safe havens from Samarkand to Kashgar, merchants traveling without fear of betrayal, spices from India, porcelain from China, mathematics from the Islamic world, and inventions like gunpowder and the compass would spread more swiftly, more widely. European markets, still reeling from plague, would be flooded with wonders of the East. Asian dynasties would absorb ideas and innovations from Europe at a faster pace. The exchange of thought, art, and science would not stumble into darkness, but accelerate. And with trade comes culture. Imagine a Europe that, in the 14th and 15th centuries, had access not only to silks and spices, but to medical texts from Persia, astronomical charts from China, philosophies carried from India. Imagine an Asia where stories of Dante and Chaucer found their way eastward, where Western techniques in architecture and art mingled with Eastern traditions. The Renaissance, which in our world was sparked in part by whispers carried back from the East, might have ignited earlier, brighter, deeper, fueled by an uninterrupted flow of knowledge across Mongol-guarded roads. Religion, too, would bear the imprint of Mongol endurance. In our world, as the empire broke apart, Khanates hardened into rival faiths, Islam in Persia, Orthodoxy in Russia, Buddhism in the East. But under an empire with codified tolerance, the spirit of coexistence would remain. Mosques, churches, and temples would stand side by side across Central Asia. Scholars of different faiths would debate in Mongol courts, exchanging not only prayers but philosophies. Perhaps the wars of religion that scarred Europe might still have come, but in this world there would exist a living model of coexistence, an empire that had made tolerance not just policy, but identity. Politically, the ripple is vast. Russia, under Mongol oversight, would not rise as it did under the Muscovite princes. The Golden Horde, instead of weakening, would stabilize, binding Russian lands in loyalty. Without centuries of struggle to throw off Mongol rule, Russia's rise to empire might be delayed or shaped differently, born not in opposition to the steppe, but within its embrace. To the south, the Ottoman Empire might face a different fate. In our reality, the Ottomans surged westward, seizing Constantinople in 1453 and carving their dominion across the Middle East and Europe. But with a strong Ilkhanate in Persia, the Ottomans would find their advance checked. The balance of power in the Islamic world might tilt eastward, with Persia and Central Asia remaining dominant under Mongol oversight. The Islamic golden cities, Baghdad, Samarkand, Isfahan, might not fall into decline, but continue as thriving centers of culture and science. And in China, the Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan's heirs collapsed in our world, overthrown by the Ming. But with reforms, with integration of Chinese scholars into governance, rebellion might never have found fertile ground. China could have remained under Mongol rule, still Chinese, but bound to a greater empire. The Ming dynasty, which gave us voyages of exploration and porcelain wonders, might never rise. Instead, a Mongol-led China could shape its own era of expansion, perhaps sending ships across oceans earlier, guided by both Chinese invention and Mongol ambition. The Americas, too, might be touched, not directly by Mongol armies, but by the acceleration of exchange. If the Silk Road thrives longer, if Europe gains earlier access to navigational tools, to gunpowder in mass, to wealth flowing steadily from Asia, the age of exploration might dawn not in the late 15th century, but a century earlier. Ships might cross the Atlantic decades before Columbus, and behind them would stand not fractured Khanates, but a Mongol Empire, shaping the goods, knowledge, and wealth that fueled their sails. Even the plague, though devastating, might have had a different legacy. The Mongols could not stop it entirely, but a unified empire might have coordinated responses, quarantines, and aid. The death toll might still have been vast, but the recovery, bolstered by stable trade and governance, could have been swifter. Where Europe staggered in darkness, it might have regained its footing sooner, guided by a stronger connection with Asia. And what of identity? What of culture? If the Mongol Empire had endured, we might today live in a world where the steppes are not a forgotten frontier, but the remembered heart of civilization. The Mongol legacy, often remembered for fire and terror, might instead be honored for law, for roads, for unity. The horse, the yurt, the eternal blue sky, symbols not of destruction, but of endurance. Our maps, our languages, our very borders might carry traces of their permanence, but history is never without its shadows. A lasting Mongol Empire would not have meant peace for all. It would still have been an empire, still demanding loyalty, still pressing tribute. Local cultures might have been stifled, their independence delayed or denied. The diversity born of collapse, the rise of distinct powers, the flowering of nations, might have been diminished. Perhaps the world would be more unified, but less varied. Perhaps the price of stability would have been uniformity. And so, we are left with a paradox. In this alternate world, the Mongol Empire endures, bringing stability, trade, tolerance, and unity. Yet in doing so, it reshapes the destinies of countless peoples. Russia, the Ottomans, the Ming, all changed, perhaps diminished. The Renaissance and the Age of Exploration accelerated or altered. A world safer, more connected, more uniform, but perhaps less free. It is a vision both tempting and troubling. A reminder that every empire carries within it both promise and peril, that the endurance of power can be both a gift and a chain, that sometimes collapse, as painful as it is, gives birth to diversity, to renewal, to the world we know. And so, we return from the echoing hooves of the past, from the dust of battlefields and the whisper of caravan bells, to stand once more in the present. We have seen how the Mongol Empire rose with fire and steel, how it shattered under the weight of its own divisions, and how in another timeline it might have endured, transformed from conqueror into guardian, from destroyer into unifier. But what does this vision leave us with? It leaves us with questions that stretch far beyond the steppes. Would the world have been better beneath the long shadow of a single empire, its roads safe, its trade eternal, its tolerance unmatched? Or would such a world have been poorer in its diversity, its freedom stifled, its nations unborn? Is collapse a tragedy or a necessity? Perhaps the Mongol Empire teaches us this, that power, no matter how vast, is fragile without wisdom, that unity is not built only on conquest, but on vision, and that endurance is not about the strength to conquer, but the ability to adapt. History as we know it is a story of empires that rise, shine, and fade, Yet in the fall of one empire, countless others are born. The Mongols did not survive as rulers, but their legacy lingers. In our trade, in our maps, in the mingling of East and West. Their collapse opened space for the world we know today. Still, the question remains, hanging like a star above the horizon. What if? What if the banners of the Mongols still waved over the Silk Road? What if the eternal blue sky had watched over centuries of stability rather than centuries of fracture? What if the greatest empire the world had ever seen never fell? The answer is not fixed. It lives in imagination, in reflection, in the way we see our own time. For the fate of empires is not only the story of the past, it is the mirror of the present and the warning of the future. If this journey has stirred your thoughts, if it has made you question, wonder, and dream, then join us again. There are countless more echoes of history to explore, countless more worlds to reimagine. Subscribe to What If Wars and walk with us into the stories of what was and what might have been. Until then, remember, empires rise, empires fall, but imagination endures.